Hello and welcome to the Freight Flow Advisor Brief. Today we're talking about Washington's newest toy, the Build America 250 Act. It's a 5-year surface transportation bill that House leaders just dropped to replace the current law before it expires this September. On paper, it's about roads, bridges, transit, and rail. In reality, it's something much more specific. It's a freight first bill, and it's quietly going to decide who gets tailwinds and who gets headwinds, and where the next decade of supply chain friction is going to come from. If you run a carrier, invest in freight tech, or manage a network that actually has to hit a dock time, this one's worth your attention. So let's set the table. On May 17th, House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Sam Graves, a Republican from Missouri, and Ranking Member Rick Larsen, a Democrat from Washington, released the text of a bipartisan 5-year surface transportation reauthorization called Build America 250 Act, building unrivaled infrastructure and long-term development for the America's 250th anniversary, which is a nod to the upcoming semi-quincentennial celebrations. In their own words, the bill is supposed to emphasize moving people, goods, and freight safely and efficiently across the country. It promises the largest ever investment in America's bridges, continues core highway and transit programs, improves rail safety, and this is the big one, creates the first ever federal framework for autonomous commercial motor vehicles. Independent analysis pegs the package at around $674 billion over 5 years, with about $240 billion in authorized and direct funding that's squarely in the trucking, rail, aviation, and port universe. So yes, the top line number is big, but the more interesting thing, especially for freight, is how that money is aimed. So we're going to follow the money. If you walk away with nothing else from this episode, take this. This bill is not trying to rebalance the transportation system. It's trying to make the highway and freight core of that system work better. And here's what that means in practice. First, bridges and highways sit at the center of the bullseye. Committee leaders are out front saying this is the largest bridge investment in U.S. history. We're talking about north of $50 billion just for bridges. In a world where a single freight bridge shut down for inspection can throw rate sheets into chaos, that's not just good civil engineering, that's supply chain risk management. Second, the structure leans heavily on formula funding. Think about the usual suspects that have large DOT project pipelines like Texas, California, Florida, Ohio, New York. Now, if you operate networks anchored in those states, this is good news. You've got a federal river of cash flowing into the same corridors your trucks and trains already live. If you're in a smaller or more transit dependent region, the story gets a little bit more complicated. So let's talk about trucking, because on this bill, trucking walks away with some very real wins. So win number one is truck parking. The fiscal 2026 transportation spending bill, the one that's already law, not just proposed, includes $200 million dedicated specifically to truck parking. That's the first time Congress has carved out money exclusively for parking, and the American Trucking Association is calling it a historic first. And this isn't just a feel-good policy. According to a US DOT cited study, 98% of truck drivers regularly experience problems finding safe parking. The American Transportation Research Institute found that the average driver burns 56 minutes of drive time every single day hunting for a spot, which ATA translates into $6,813 in lost wages per driver per year. If you're a carrier executive, you know exactly what that means. That's not abstract congestion cost. That is a hard operating ratio, that is driver retention, that is compliance risk, and that is real opportunity cost in every single lane. Win number two, the autonomous vehicle framework. FreightWaves points out that tucked inside the bill in subtitle E, the safe integration of autonomous commercial motor vehicles exists. It doesn't flip a switch and legalize driverless trucks tomorrow. What it does is hand US DOT a 2-year homework assignment to write a performance-based safety standard for automated trucks operating in interstate commerce. And that's huge. Until now, autonomous trucking has been governed by a patchwork of state rules, waivers, and pilot programs. And that's fine when you've got a few test corridors. It's not fine when you're talking about scaling freight automation across I-10, I-40, or even I-35. Kodiak, one of the autonomous vehicle players, already put out a statement basically saying this federal framework is what allows us to move from can we to how fast can we. If you're a fleet CTO or an investor in freight tech, you know what regulatory certainty does to a business case. So, as always, let's take a quick pause because if you're still listening at this point, you're exactly who this message is for. This episode is brought to you by Freight FA and specifically Freight GPT. Right now, federal policy is literally changing the math under your network. $200 million going into truck parking changes, utilization, and dwell patterns. Billions in bridge and highway work will reroute congestion, work zones, and lead times over the next 5 years. A federal autonomous vehicle framework could bring autonomous trucks into lanes you compete on a lot sooner than your TMS roadmap assumes. The problem is, most carriers and shippers are still pricing freight like it's 2018. And while that feels like yesterday, it's really just guessing. They're running last quarter plus a shrug and hoping that's enough. Freight GPT is built to fix that for you. Freight GPT is your AI freight analyst that actually speaks your language. It sits on top of Freight FA's cost intelligence engine and lets you ask the questions you actually care about. For example, you could ask, what happens to my cost per mile on Dallas to Atlanta if this bridge project pushes 20% more volume onto my secondary route? You see, under the hood, Freight FA is crunching lane level cost estimates, equipment, fuel, labor, tolls, time, and Freight GPT translates that into an instant scenario, better quotes, and just overall sharper bids. So instead of reacting to this bill after your competitors do, you can model it now. Price tighter on lanes that are about to get infrastructure tailwinds. Protect margin on lanes about to live under orange barrels for 5 years. And be the shipper or carrier in the room that actually has a number, not just a gut feeling. If you want to turn legislation like the Build America 250 Act into a pricing advantage instead of just another headline, go to freightfa.com and check out Freight GPT. Again, that's freightfa.com. So as we transition back to the bill, you need to know that because there is a winner, that often implies there is a loser. The first group in that category is transit-dependent systems. HDR's Federal Transit Funding Review points out that the administration has requested a 63% cut to the Federal Capital Investment Grants Program, down to about $1.2 billion. At the same time, there are 46 eligible CIG projects in the pipeline, collectively asking for over $28 billion. That's roughly 24 times the requested funding level. Now, the CIG program isn't freight in the narrow sense. It funds light rail, BRT, heavy rail extensions. But if you run freight in a major metro, you live with the downstream consequences. Labor that can't reach your warehouses reliably, customers who push more truck traffic into neighborhoods, and ports that have to absorb more car trips because transit capacity never grew. The second group in this category is rural transit. And this is where politics gets interesting because the Urban Institute looked at proposed federal transit cuts and concluded they would hit rural and small communities the hardest. Why? Because rural agencies are unusually dependent on Washington. Federal dollars cover something like 45% of operating costs and more than 70% of capital for typical rural transit systems. Transportation for America went further, calling the cuts functionally an attack on those communities' transit system, and specifically flagging red state regions like Nevada, Texas, and West Virginia as disproportionately exposed. In other words, the same regions that depend on trucked freight for everything, food, medicine, inputs, they're also the ones that are seeing their non-freight mobility weakened. Now, the third group in this category is communities hoping to repair past highway damage. Transportation for America has been tracking the Reconnecting Communities Neighborhood Access and Equity funding. Their latest update says House Republicans are targeting around $3.1 billion in unobligated funds for repeal, roughly 97% of the remaining program, potentially stranding 78 awarded projects that were supposed to help reconnect neighborhoods cut apart by mid-century highway construction. Those projects don't show up on a P&L the way a new interchange does, but they do show up in local land values, labor access, and political stability. When people feel like they get the downside of freight without any of the upside, you eventually see it in zoning fights, permit delays, and the cost of doing business. So you may be asking, what about rail? On the surface, rail advocates can say, we've got something. The overall package includes substantial funding for passenger and freight rail. And the bill text talks about improving rail safety and investing in passenger rail with some reforms. But when you look at the recent appropriations, the picture gets cloudier. In the fiscal year 2026 spending deal, Amtrak funding was trimmed, and the federal state partnership for intercity passenger rail program, which is a key source of money for big intercity projects, saw its funding fall from about $1.5 billion to just $65 million. For freight railroads and shippers, the CRISI program and grade crossing investments still matter. They reduce risk, they improve dwell, and they take trucks off of certain lanes. But the idea of a dramatic nationwide build out of passenger rail that might meaningfully shift truckload demand, this bill environment is not built for that. Okay, so let's bring this home. If you're a trucking executive, the takeaways are pretty clean. You're getting better parking, some policy tailwind around autonomous tech, and billions into roads and bridges your fleet actually uses. But you're also looking at a labor ecosystem where transit cuts and rural mobility gaps could make it harder for people to get to your yards, warehouses, and distribution centers. If you're a shipper or 3PL, this is the moment to ask, which of my lanes are about to get infrastructure tailwinds? Which lanes are heading into construction hell for 5 seasons straight? And what happens to my cost to serve when certain metros lose transit frequency and I have to pay more to attract and retain labor? So zooming back out, this bill is a freight first bill. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The U.S. economy runs on highways and trucks, and pretending otherwise doesn't make intermodal any cheaper. But a freight first bill that underweights transit, rural mobility, and neighborhood repair is also a bill that, intentionally or not, is baking in the next set of choke points: labor access, community opposition, and corridors where everything moves but nobody can actually live near the jobs. So listen, that's it for today. If you've enjoyed the episode, make sure that you share it with a colleague. If you want to follow us online, you can find us at LinkedIn or Facebook. Just type in at Freight Flow Advisor. If you want to read more about the America 250 Act, head to substack.com and search the Freight FA Brief, where you will find a custom curated article for this podcast. And speaking of podcasts, you can listen to us on Apple and Spotify, or you can watch us on YouTube. Until next time, this has been your Freight Flow Advisor Brief.